What happened to me is something I struggle to come to terms with and explain, even now. What I am about to tell you, well, it ties to the incident that happened in the northern Urals back in 1959. I was obsessed with it, you might say. I spent countless amount of hours poring over documents I could find online, old newspapers, various forums, and fringe websites. The consensus online seemed to point to a cover-up of some kind, and I agreed with this. I was never a professional hiker or backpacker. I only came across the story by accident while digging through some strange accounts online, and after that, I started reading everything that I could find. Every version of the story I read years apart seemed to have holes or differences. It seemed like every time I looked, the official story was changed or altered. I decided that the only way to get close to the truth was to retrace the steps of the Dyatlov group myself and see what I could find. I knew a few people with hiking experience, but none of them wanted to attempt a route that difficult in winter. My best friend Alex suggested hiring a local guide, and then decided to come with me. We waited until winter, so the conditions would be as close as possible to those of 1959. A couple of weeks before our planned start, Alex and I took a train to Ural. We needed time to check our gear, find a guide, and leave supplies along the route so that we would not have to carry everything. I will skip the journey itself because nothing important happened. A guide was easy enough to find since Dyatlov Pass is still a known tourist route. A local forester with an old UAZ helped us drop off some supplies. After that, we did the old Russian tradition, namely, going into the only bar in town and having some shots of vodka. After some time, I went outside for a cigarette. Beyond the weak circle of light from the street lamp over the bar, everything turned blue and black. There was a strange silence too. I was standing there, smoking, when a figure suddenly appeared in front of me, right at the edge of the light. I thought at first it was one of the Mansi locals. The person was standing against the lamp, so I could not make out the face, or even say for sure if it was a man or a woman. The long hair did not help, since both men and women wore it that way around there. Still, something told me it was a man. He spoke in a hoarse, metallic voice, saying words that I first mistook for Mansi, though later I became sure that they had nothing to do with that language. I could not even possibly type out what I think he said. I asked if he spoke Russian or English, because those were the only two languages that I knew. Instead of answering, he grabbed my hand and started shaking it while trying to push a small bag into my palm. He kept repeating one phrase like a prayer or a warning. At the time, I thought he was trying to sell me something worthless for vodka money. I was drunk enough to get angry, so I pulled free and waved him away. He backed away into the darkness, and for a second, just a second, I saw his eyes flash. Then something bright shot up beyond him, like a comet rising over the horizon. The flash immediately reminded me of the strange luminous object that was supposedly photographed in 1959, one of the last photos taken before the Dyatlov group died. Investigators had hidden that photograph for years, and many people believed it showed the trace of a secret Soviet R-12 missile from the Kapustin test site. I grabbed my phone and tried to open the camera, but by the time I looked up again, the sky was empty. The bag was lying at my feet. I was surprised the stranger had left it behind, since I had been sure he wanted money or alcohol for it. I picked it up anyway and went back inside to show Alex, but he was already drunk and busy with a local girl. So I left it for the morning. I got to chatting with some locals, and I brought up the subject. They told me all sorts of theories. An old man named Petrovich joined in with me and another old man, and they said it could have been a missile that killed them, which was being tested then, or the Burya project, the first Soviet intercontinental cruise missile. He had once been a military engineer and claimed to know something about those test sites. When I asked if people still saw luminous objects in the sky, the men went quiet and then burst out laughing. They said the test sites were abandoned now. The military unit had been disbanded, and modern UFO stories were just the ravings of superstitious people trying to scare outsiders. They said the old Manse had always told stories about beings from the sky and strange creatures from beyond the mountains. Ancient people had treated these things like gods and even described them in detail, which the locals took as proof that they were only myths. I listened to some of the stories because I was drunk and bored. Petrovich knew the stories best because his wife was Manse. She had warned him many times not to go near the mountain of the dead, Kurlatsakyol. He said those mountains had always been lifeless, with cold rocky slopes and almost no vegetation. They stood there on the route like either a road or an obstacle. According to him, it had been that way since ancient times, when people still wore animal skins and were afraid to light fires because fire belonged to the sky. According to the old stories, the land around those mountains had once been used by a small number of nomads. In those distant times, they saw a blackness hang over the flat plateau, followed by a terrible cold. A storm came with it, stronger than anything they ever knew. The ground shook, lightning split the sky, and when it finally passed, they saw something impossible standing in the scorched earth. It was a tall, vertical structure shining in the sun, visible from several days away. For a long time, it gave off a piercing sound, then slowly sank into the ground until it vanished. In its place, there remained a huge, vertical opening, which the nomads called the Laughing Abyss. The legend said that it had 3 levels, and that deep below it, there was a hollow land with its own, really weak, wrong sun. Under that sun lay the so-called spare people. A suffocating smell rose from the opening, so no one settled nearby. Sometimes, a rotating island could be seen above the mouth, though later stories claimed it was actually the lid of the abyss opening and closing. Anyone who tried to enter that place out of curiosity never returned. That was the local legend. I asked what the ancient beings in the Laughing Abyss were supposed to look like. I eventually managed to get out of them that the spare people underneath the mountains had been created by the ancients who had come from the stars. The spare people, according to legend, were meant to replace those living on Earth after the flowers of pain bloomed and all normal life disappeared. Mansi shamans, according to the story, served the ancients in the Laughing Abysses to delay that time and prolong their people's stay on the surface. The ancients themselves were described badly, as if the people telling the story did not really have the proper words for them. Some said they had tentacles, trunks, scales, swollen growths, insect eyes, wings like membranes, jointed limbs, and fins along their back. Others insisted that no description was close enough because the things were built by a logic that had nothing to do with Earth. I went home because I decided I had heard enough myths and tall tales for one night. I wrote it all off as a bunch of bullshit, really. In the morning, we loaded into the UAZ and drove without incident to the logging camp. From there, we took our cash supplies and moved toward the abandoned settlement of the second northern mine where a guide was waiting. We arrived in the evening, and he advised us to camp inside a cave that had once been part of the mine. It sheltered us from the wind and the frost, so we lit a fire, set up the tents, and talked until midnight. Toward morning, voices woke me. At first, I thought Alex and the guide had gone deeper into the cave, but the voices did not sound like either of them. There were 2 speakers, one young and one older. The sound seemed to come from inside the cave itself, though I could see no one. I decided I was hearing echoes or some strange cave noise, pulled the sleeping bag over my head, and went back to sleep. In the morning, I asked the others about the sound, but neither of them had heard anything or gone walking in the cave. We put that out of our minds and began the real trek. First on skis along Dyatlov's route by the Lozva River, then along the Mansi Trail. At our second campsite, all of us heard the voices again. They were nearby, or sounded nearby, but we could not make out the words and saw no one around us. By January 31st, we reached Mount Kolat and spent the night on its slopes, keeping as close as possible to the Dyatlov group's route because the weather was good enough to allow it. After everything we had heard in Ivdel, Alex and I decided to search the surrounding area for traces of the missile wreckage Petrovich had talked about. For years, people had followed the route, but often they would not follow it down to the letter and would meander off, so I still believed that we might find something others had missed. We climbed the slope until my legs shook, and I was ready to turn back when Alex called out. In the low sun, he had seen a metallic glint higher up the mountain, not far from the place where the Dyatlov group had made their final camp. We photographed it with the DSLR and marked its position on the map so that we could go there at dawn. The guide agreed, though he warned us that we would need to move faster than planned. He suggested leaving most of our supplies in the camp and traveling light, then returning before conditions changed. We took only flashlights, cameras, a satellite phone, notebooks, pencils, and one day's food. The next morning, voices woke us again. By then, we had almost grown used to the strange sounds underneath the mountain. But while we prepared to climb, I suddenly realized I had heard that language before. It was the same voice, or the same kind of voice, that had spoken to me outside the bar. The voices sounded human enough that we first thought that they might be Mansi, maybe speaking some private dialect or some old language kept amongst themselves. Apart from the voices, there was no sign of anyone. We searched the dead space around the campsite, looking between the rocks and across the empty slopes, and we saw nothing. That was the first time I regretted bringing no weapon with me, aside from our camp knives. The tension got to all of us. The climb itself was manageable, but it took a lot of effort. At the top, we found ourselves on a huge slope of broken stone. To the west was the grey metallic circle we had seen the night before, and to the east stood the remains of the ancient giants, the stone pillars of the old legends. Snow dust was spinning high above us, which meant whirlwinds were forming near the summit, though where we stood, the air was still pretty calm. We hurried toward the glint and found our first disappointment. It was no wreckage, no part of a missile, no hidden Soviet secret. It was only a crust of wind-polished ice. From a distance, and in the light of the setting sun, it had looked like dull metal. We cursed our own stupidity and started back toward camp, hoping to pack quickly and still reach the Dyatlov group's final campsite before dark. But, we never got the chance. The whirlwind that had seemed distant before came down on us all at once, and within minutes, the whole slope disappeared inside a violent blizzard. The wind cut through my clothes, the snow hit my face like sand, and every single breath I took burned as if I were swallowing gasoline. I could not see Alex or the guide through the white wall around me. I ran in what I believed was the direction of the camp, hoping the hill would guide me back to the tent, or at least shield me from the worst of it. I tried to breathe slowly, because I remembered the air warms more if it passes through the throat slower, but I was panicking, so that was almost impossible. There was so much snow underneath my feet. There had not been half as much even just hours ago, but nothing made sense to me anymore. I had become desensitized to everything that was going on and could only think about getting to safety. My fingers stopped moving at all. They were frozen stuck. My legs weakened. The wind shoved me backwards again and again, and I moved forward only through basic instinct. It was almost like my body was acting on autopilot and refusing to die. Soon, my thoughts just broke apart, and I started to get these weird images inside of my head, these flashes. I had flashes of being back at home, or in some camp from childhood. Then there would be nothing except cold, pain, light, and darkness. It took time before I understood the darkness in front of me was real and wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me, or more images flashing in my head. I legit could not see anything. I just stared for a while, trying to figure out what was going on before I focused my eyes. I realized I was standing in the mouth of a cave. I had somehow found shelter without even knowing it. I did not think for long. I went deeper inside, away from the storm, down toward what I stupidly imagined would be warmth. The passage sloped downward, and after maybe 150 meters, it did become warmer. Once my eyes adjusted, I saw that the walls were covered in ancient writing and worn bas-reliefs. They were half erased and worn down, though they were still clear enough to see, even in the weak light. The entrance to this cave must have been level with the ground, which explained why we had missed it from the outside, and I must have stumbled into it half frozen by accident. Only then did I remember the small amount of gear that we had brought. I pulled dried meat out from my pack and ate it without chewing. Then I drank some strong camp tea from my flask and sat on the stone floor until I got some of my strength back. The corridor was quiet except for the storm at the entrance. I fell asleep there without meaning to. I don't even know how that was possible with how much anxiety I was feeling. It was almost like I was lulled into a trance and just could not stop it. When I woke back up, I was cold again. The wind outside had grown worse, and the air around me was strange. I could hear what sounded and felt almost like electric sparks, but like circling my head and my ears. In that moment, I panicked. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and swept the beam across the walls. The same inscriptions continued down the tunnel. Behind me was the outer darkness of the storm. Ahead of me was a deeper blackness underneath the mountain. I did not want to go back outside, so I moved further in, telling myself that if people lived there, I might find help, or at the very least, I could get better shelter from the storm. That is all I could think of, that maybe the legends were true, and the natives who lived around here could guide me home. I was stupid and naive, I know. The bas-reliefs repeated the same images again and again. I saw symbols like twisted trees, these strange half-sphere type things, and a man in a boat. They meant absolutely nothing to me. The writing looked to me like some impossible mixture of Sanskrit and Latin. The passage seemed to go on forever, though it could not have been as long as it felt. Then it ended, and below me opened up a space so huge my mind could barely even accept it. A stone staircase dropped into an underground valley, maybe 700 steps down. At the bottom was something I can only describe as the inside of a gigantic spacecraft, because I have no better word for it. In the center stood a vast, domed machine glowing with a dead blue light. Around it was metal rooms that stretched around, corridors covered in dust, and random hallways that looked to have random bits of machinery strewn about or built into the walls. Beyond them, farther than my flashlight could even reach, were rows upon rows of suspended chambers. These chambers, they were more like rooms, like prison cells, although they were not made of stone. They had no bars or anything like that, but there was something over them and covering them, like a bubble of some kind, but made out of a type of glass, it looked like. There were people inside of them, laying there and not moving, like they were just statues. My brain could not cope with what I was seeing, and I had a million thoughts racing through my head. I descended a little bit deeper. It got warmer the closer that I got. This ship-like thing that was down here, it made no sense. There were no lines or shapes or pieces of engineering that you would expect from a machine. It just straight up looked like a vague blob of interconnected bits, like what someone who cannot see images clearly in their head would say when they tried to think of a ship. The structure around the reactor was laid out like a maze. The floor levels kept changing in ways that I could not make sense of. 1 minute, I seemed to be lower than the reactor, and then higher, even though I did not feel like I had climbed or descended enough for that to be possible. The whole place played these tricks on my sense of distance. It was like I was in a dream and not actually moving through a physical, tangible space. 1 second I was in one place, and the next second my brain had imagined an entirely new backdrop. When I reached the first rows of chambers, I slowed down. These chambers were filled with bodies lying on beds. They looked almost human, but they weren't. They were too tall, their skin too devoid of color, more like a sickly gray. It's hard to even remember what they actually looked like when I think about it. My head hurt just being near them, like I felt a heavy pressure. Some of the bodies in there were just dried remains. Some of them had these same bodies intact, but hooked up to machines that did not make sense. In some of them, the glass had been smashed entirely and was just fractured all around the room. And then there was one room that looked different. The glass was scored from the inside with deep grooves, as if the people inside had tried to claw their way out. Those beings looked human too, except for the white irises around their pupils. They were frozen in poses of terror, their faces twisted, and they looked horrifying. I was so caught up in thought that I did not notice at first that I was hearing a new sound. I heard the hum of electricity. I searched all around with my flashlight, expecting to see cables, conduits, anything carrying power from the reactor to the chambers, but there was just nothing all around. Still, I could feel a current in the air, that same kind of charge that you feel in the air after a thunderstorm or during one. You can just feel it on your skin, on the hairs on your neck. I moved closer to the reactor so I could get a better look and inspect it. The blue glow underneath the dome did not come from metal or light panels. It came from some kind of a thick, shining slime, and inside that slime, there were things just moving around that looked like larvae. They had joined parts and soft bodies that were pulsing and wriggling. They had these tentacle-like things coming off of them, and they had these openings on them that seemed to react to the air, like just tiny little holes that would expand and contract and pulse at different points like it was breathing. Just staring at them made me feel sick, and they made my head hurt too. I just stood there, staring, unable to pull my eyes away, and I could feel this sick numbness passing through my body. If someone had not screamed at that moment, I think I would have just stayed there, just staring for a long, long time. The scream sounded really familiar, actually. It sounded very human. I turned just by reflex, without even thinking about it, and that small movement that I made broke whatever hold the blue glow had on me. I felt in control of my body again. I felt like I could move. Across one of the corridors, at some distance away, I couldn't be sure how far because, like I said, this place was playing tricks on me. I saw a line of figures moving through the ship. I could not tell what they were. They looked tall and almost human, but they did not register as human to me. They were leading Alex and the guy between them. I was so shocked to see Alex. Both men were completely alive, safe from the snowstorm outside, or at least alive enough to walk, but they were just following along these things without any fight. I could not believe that they were here, in the same place. They were just shambling forward, like they could not walk properly, and they were in a trance of some kind. I wanted to run to them, I really did, but I could not move. My body stayed locked in place no matter what I tried. I could breathe and I could see, but my body would do nothing. Once I finally was able to move, the line of things and my friends had already moved into a new area. It was a vast open space, like a giant square room. The floor of this place, it was filled with bodies. The area looked like a stadium, larger than I had ever seen. Some of these bodies were still fresh, as if they had died very recently, or at least had been preserved by the snow. Some of the bodies, they were human, and some of the bodies looked not human. Some of the bodies, they looked the same as those things leading my friends. Some of the bodies on the floor had bits of their skin exposed or pulled off or were just rotting. Some of them looked as if they had been partially liquefied, or as if parts of skin and bone had been melted into this jelly-like substance. There was a pile of bodies a little off to the side that was literally just a mass of humans, and these things all decayed and melted into each other like a gigantic mass. Some of the alien ones, they were they were still squirming. The human bodies were stone dead, but these things were still trying to wriggle, even though they were now just a head and barely even a body. They were just trying hopelessly to bite and wriggle and free themselves, and they were making these groaning sounds that sounded like air had been trapped for years, escaping their lungs. Some that still had a partial body. They were crawling over the top of the mass, trying desperately to get away. But there was this sludge-like substance that was sticking to them that slowed down their movements until eventually they became tired and just laid down and gave up. The thing at the front of my friends raised its hands towards the roof of the room that was lit up blue and began chanting in a tongue I could not understand. When it chanted, I could hear noises. I could feel vibrations. The things in the reactor behind me, those slime-like things, at the sound of this, they began shaking and moving. These partial bodies on the ground, covered in sludge, I saw their skin start to glow. I could see this blue liquid-type thing almost flowing through their skin, as if it was partially see-through. I wanted to vomit right then and there, but my body would not let me. I remember Alex and the guide being led over to the pile. I remember that they did not fight or scream. They just sat down peacefully, and one of these things sat down too. I remember this thing gripping Alex by the throat, and then one of the things on the pile started making that noise again and trying to drag Alex and this other thing down onto the ground. I started to hear and feel a buzzing right behind me, and I just ran. I did it on instinct. The whole time that I was running, I had those images flashing through my head again. They felt so real. At one point, I could not even feel my body anymore. It felt so light, like I was a cloud, and all I saw was these images. I didn't even know whether I was still running or not. I saw images, an image of my mother telling me to get up for school. I saw myself relaxing with friends on the beach during summer. It's really hard to convey here with just words, but these images felt like they lasted for a very long time. It felt almost as if I lived like whole entire lifetimes in the short amount of time it took me to run from this cave. I would live for years and years, and then these dreams would just go wrong. People would get hurt and die, and I would see clues that the world was not real. I would try to explain to my mom that things here were not real, that I was scared I was dead in the real world, and she would just turn her head and give me a big grin and tell me it was okay, that I could stay there with her forever. When I finally woke up for real, I was in a hospital in Moscow. They told me that hikers heading toward Dyatlov Pass had found me frozen near a logging village, clinging to an old power line pole. I got off pretty lightly, considering everything that happened. They amputated the fingers on my left hand and both feet. They were completely useless due to the frostbite I had suffered. I kicked up a stink about my friend and the guide. I begged the authorities to do something, but aside from a half-assed search, they were not interested in risking men in such a dangerous place. They said that if my friends had been in a cave for as long as I claimed, that they were already dead. And so that's what happened. I don't have an explanation at all. I did not have any way to help my friend. I have never felt so useless in all of my life, and I still have nightmares about my friend wandering off so calmly to his death. I have never, ever gone back to investigate. I feel like even if I tried, I would never make it back.